The stagecoach door slammed shut with a force that made Eleanor Morgan stumble backward. Dust from the Wyoming street settled on her worn traveling dress as she clutched her carpet bag tighter, her knuckles white against the faded fabric. 28 years old, Victor Thornhill looked her up and down like she was a horse he was considering buying and finding the animal wanting. His lip curled in disgust. The advertisement said a woman of marriageable age. Good Lord, you're practically dried up. Eleanor's throat tightened. She had practiced what she would say when she met her future husband. She had imagined 100 different conversations during the long journey from Boston. Not once had she imagined this. Please, Mr. Thornhill, she managed, hating how her voice shook. The advertisement didn't specify an age requirement. I can work hard. I'm a good cook, and I can manage a household. I promise you won't be disappointed. Thornhill laughed, a harsh sound that made several townspeople turn to stare. Eleanor felt heat creep up her neck as she realized they had an audience. A woman in a blue bonnet whispered something to her companion. Two men outside the saloon stopped mid-conversation to watch. I wanted a young wife who could give me sons, Thornhill said loudly, as if he wanted everyone to hear. Not some old maid looking for charity. I've got standards, woman. He climbed into his waiting carriage, not even bothering to look back at her. The driver flicked the reins, and Eleanor watched the only plan she had disappear down the dusty main street of Pine Ridge, Wyoming. She stood there, frozen, as the reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold wave. She had spent every penny she owned on the train ticket west. The $3.27 in her pocket were all she had left in the world. There was no money for a ticket back to Boston. No family to return to even if she could afford it. Nothing. The woman in the blue bonnet hurried past, pulling her daughter close as if poverty might be contagious. The men by the saloon had lost interest and returned to their conversation. Eleanor felt invisible and painfully visible all at the same time. Her legs carried her to a wooden bench outside the general store. She sat down carefully, her carpet bag on her lap, and tried to think. The afternoon sun beat down on her head. She had worn her best dress for the meeting, the gray one with the little buttons her mother had sewn on before she died. Now it just looked shabby and old, like everything else about her. 28. Too old. The words echoed in her mind. She had heard them before, of course. After her father died 3 years ago, the creditors had taken their house in Boston. Her younger sister Margaret had married well, a banker with a fine home, but there was no room for Eleanor there. Margaret's husband had made that clear. You understand, Eleanor, Margaret had said, not quite meeting her eyes. Thomas says it wouldn't be proper. People would think we couldn't afford our own household if we had you living with us. But I'm sure you'll find something. Eleanor had found work as a seamstress, living in a boarding house with thin walls and thinner soup. She had watched women younger than her get married, start families, build lives. And then she had seen the advertisement in the newspaper. Prosperous Wyoming rancher seeks wife for companionship and help managing household. Must be of good character and marriageable age. She had read those words as hope. Thornhill had read them as young. Ma'am? Excuse me, ma'am. Eleanor looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. A tall man stood before her, hat in his hands. He was older than Thornhill, maybe 35, with sun-bronzed skin and gray eyes that reminded her of storm clouds. He wore simple rancher's clothes, clean but well-worn. I don't mean to intrude, he said, his voice quiet and careful, like he was talking to a skittish horse. But I was across the street. I saw what happened with Thornhill. Fresh humiliation washed over Eleanor. I see, she said stiffly. Everyone in town must have seen by now. Thornhill's a fool, the man said simply. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Look, I don't know your situation, but you seem like you might need some help. Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She had been taught that decent women didn't accept help from strange men. But then again, decent women weren't supposed to be stranded in frontier towns with $3 to their name either. What kind of help? She asked cautiously. The man cleared his throat. My name's Blake Harrison. I have a ranch about 10 miles outside town. It's not fancy, but it's good land. I've been managing on my own for a while now, but the truth is, I could use some help. A housekeeper. A housekeeper, Eleanor repeated slowly. Yes, ma'am. Someone to cook, clean, maybe help with some mending. I'd pay fair wages. Room and board, of course, and $30 a month. He looked down at his hat, turning it in his hands. The cabin's small, but there's a separate room. It has a lock on the door. You'd be safe there. The fact that he mentioned the lock told Eleanor that he understood her concerns. A single woman living with a single man was scandalous, but what choice did she have? Sleep on this bench tonight? Use her last $3 for a hotel room and then starve? Why are you offering this? She asked. You don't know anything about me. Blake Harrison met her eyes steadily. I know Thornhill's a cruel man, and you didn't deserve what he did to you. I know you came a long way, and you're in a bad spot. And I know what it's like to be alone. Something flickered in his expression, there and gone. I'm not like Thornhill, ma'am. I'm just a lonely man with more land than I can manage by myself. I need help, and it seems like you need a place to stay. That's all. Eleanor studied his face. She had always been good at reading people. It was one of the few talents she possessed. Blake Harrison's face showed nothing but honest concern and a kind of awkward hopefulness. No calculation, no hidden motives that she could see. The sun was getting lower in the sky. In a few hours, it would be dark. All right, Eleanor said quietly. I'll accept your offer, Mr. Harrison. Relief crossed his face. Thank you, ma'am. And please call me Blake. He gestured toward a horse tied up across the street. We should head out soon. It's a couple hours' ride, and I'd like to get back before full dark. Eleanor stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. She picked up her carpet bag, which held everything she owned in the world. One dress, a nightgown, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents, a few letters from Margaret that she kept meaning to throw away but couldn't quite manage. As she walked toward the horse with Blake Harrison, Eleanor didn't notice the woman in the blue bonnet watching from the general store window. She didn't see the shopkeeper's wife shaking her head with concern. She was too focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on not breaking down in tears in the middle of this dusty street. Blake helped her onto his horse with surprising gentleness, then swung up behind her. Eleanor sat stiffly, very aware of the stranger at her back. Hold on, Blake said quietly, and the horse moved forward. They rode out a pine ridge as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Eleanor watched the small town disappear behind them, swallowed by the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory. She was riding into the wilderness with a man she had known for less than 10 minutes. But somehow, as the horse carried them toward the unknown, Eleanor felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen just slightly. Blake Harrison had called Thornhill a fool. He had offered her help when she had nothing and no one. He had mentioned the lock on the door without her having to ask. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The darkness gathered around them as they rode, and Eleanor closed her eyes, too exhausted to be afraid anymore. Whatever waited for her at Blake Harrison's ranch, it had to be better than that bench in town. It had to be. Behind them, Pine Ridge disappeared into the gathering night. Ahead, somewhere in the darkness, lay Eleanor's uncertain future. Blake's ranch appeared in the moonlight like something out of a dream. A small log cabin sat nestled against a hillside, with a barn and corral nearby. It wasn't grand, but everything looked sturdy and well-maintained. Eleanor felt a flutter of relief in her chest. Blake dismounted and helped her down, his hands steady at her waist. It's not much, he said, almost apologetically, but it's home. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. One main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and 2 doors leading to what she assumed were bedrooms. Blake lit a lantern, and warm light filled the space. This one's yours, Blake said, opening one of the doors. Eleanor peered inside to see a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a wooden chest. Like I said, it has a lock. Keys in the door. He stepped back quickly, as if he didn't want her to think he was trying to enter her space. You must be exhausted. I'll fix us something to eat. Eleanor watched as Blake moved around the kitchen with surprising ease. He wasn't graceful exactly, but he knew what he was doing. Within 20 minutes, he had produced a simple meal of beans, bread, and coffee. They ate in awkward silence. Eleanor was so tired she could barely taste the food, but it was warm and filling. Blake kept his eyes mostly on his plate, occasionally glancing up at her with something that looked like concern. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally. "For everything." Blake nodded. "We could talk more in the morning. Work out the details of your wages and such. For tonight, just rest." Eleanor did rest, though she locked her door first. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to Blake moving around in the other room, and then silence. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safe. 2 weeks passed in a kind of gentle rhythm. Eleanor woke early each morning and prepared breakfast. Blake was always polite, always respectful, keeping a careful distance between them. He worked the ranch during the day, while Eleanor cleaned, cooked, and tried to bring some order to the bachelor household. She discovered Blake's attempts at domesticity in odd places. Mismatched dishes stacked haphazardly, shirts with buttons sewn on crooked, a valiant but failed attempt at curtains that hung at wrong angles. Slowly, Eleanor began to transform the cabin. She made proper curtains from fabric she found in the chest. She organized the shelves and started a small herb garden near the kitchen door. Blake noticed. He didn't say much, but she caught him looking at the curtains with something like wonder, running his hand along the smooth surface of the newly organized table. "It looks real nice," he said one evening. "Feels like a home again." Again, Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. Blake's expression shifted, became distant. "I was married once. Sarah. She died 3 years ago. Her and the baby both. Childbirth." He stared into the fireplace. "After that, I couldn't seem to make this place feel right anymore. Easier to just let it be." Eleanor's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Blake." He shook his head. "It's why I understand what it's like to be alone. Why I couldn't just leave you on that bench." His gray eyes met hers. "Easier to be alone than risk that kind of pain again, I thought. But alone is its own kind of pain, turns out." Eleanor found herself sharing things she hadn't planned to. About her parents. About Margaret. About feeling invisible her whole life, like she was always in a way, always too much or not enough. "You're not invisible," Blake said quietly. "Thornhill was wrong. You're not too old. You're just right." He looked embarrassed as soon as the words left his mouth, like he'd said too much. Something warm bloomed in Eleanor's chest, something she didn't dare name yet. The following week, Blake announced they needed supplies from town. Eleanor's stomach knotted with anxiety, but she agreed to go. She couldn't hide forever. Pine Ridge looked the same as it had 2 weeks ago, but this time Eleanor wasn't alone. Blake drove the wagon with steady confidence, and when they passed people on the street, he nodded politely. Eleanor kept her head high, even when she saw the stares and heard the whispers. Shameful, living out there with him. One woman murmured to another, not quite quietly enough. "No better than she should be," came the reply. Blake's jaw tightened. He stopped the wagon and climbed down, walking directly to the two women. "Mrs. Patterson, Mrs. Doyle, I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your opinions to yourselves. Miss Morgan is my employee, nothing more, and she's a fine woman who deserves your respect, not your gossip." The women flushed and hurried away. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of gratitude. No one had ever defended her like that. Inside the general store, the shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Chun, was kinder. She helped Eleanor select fabric and supplies, but as they talked, her expression grew concerned. "I don't mean to pry, dear, but people will talk. A single man and a single woman under one roof. It's not proper, even if he is paying you wages. You might consider finding a chaperone, or she hesitated. Well, we're making the arrangement more official. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Eleanor could feel the weight of Mrs. Chen's words hanging between them. Blake's hands were tight on the reins, his jaw set. That evening, Blake paced in front of the fireplace while Eleanor pretended to mend a shirt. Finally, he stopped and turned to face her. "I have a proposition," he said. "Hear me out before you answer." Blake ran his hand through his hair, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. Eleanor set down her mending, her heart beating faster. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "The talk in town," he began, "it's not going to stop. Mrs. Chun was right. People see a single man and a single woman living together, and they think the worst." He took a breath. "I've been thinking about this for days now, and I think there's only one solution that makes sense." Eleanor waited, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I'm proposing we get married," Blake said in a rush. "But not a real marriage. Not like that. Just a marriage of convenience. On paper, it would stop the gossip, give you legal protection and security. You'd have my name, a legitimate position, and I'd have help with the ranch without people tearing your reputation to shreds." He finally looked at her. "We keep everything else the same. Separate rooms. No expectations. Just a partnership. A business arrangement." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. Over the past 2 weeks, she had begun to feel things for Blake Harrison. The way he was gentle with injured animals. How he always made sure she had enough firewood before he went to bed. The rare smile that transformed his serious face. She had started imagining what it might be like if this arrangement became something more. And now he was offering her a marriage that would be nothing but a piece of paper. "I need time to think about it," she said quietly. Blake nodded, looking almost relieved to have the words out. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He retreated to his room, leaving Eleanor alone by the dying fire. She lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. Her practical side said to accept. It was security, protection, respectability. But her heart, the part of her that had started to hope for something real, ached at the thought of a loveless arrangement. Still, what choice did she have? And maybe, over time, something could grow between them. Maybe convenience could turn into something more. Morning came too soon. Eleanor made breakfast with shaking hands, rehearsing what she would say. Blake appeared looking as tired as she felt, his hair uncombed, shadows under his eyes. They sat down at the table, and Eleanor opened her mouth to give him her answer. A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Blake frowned and went to answer it. The Pine Ridge sheriff stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable. "Morning, Blake." "Miss Morgan." He nodded at Eleanor. "I'm afraid I've got a situation here. Victor Thornhill came to my office yesterday. He's claiming Miss Morgan stole from him. Says she took money he'd advanced her for the journey west." "That's a lie." Eleanor gasped, standing up. "He never gave me anything. I paid my own way." The sheriff held up his hand. "I'm inclined to believe you, miss. Thornhill's not known for his honesty, but he's got influence in this territory, and he's demanding I bring you in for questioning. Without some kind of proof of your current employment status or legal standing, I gotta follow procedure." Blake moved to stand beside Eleanor. "She's my employee. I'm paying her wages." "That may be, but Thornhill's arguing she had no right to work for you, that she was under contract to him." The sheriff looked pained. "I'm sorry, Blake. Unless you can show me something more official, something legal, I'm going to have to ask Miss Morgan to come with me." Eleanor felt the room tilt. After everything, Thornhill was still finding ways to hurt her. She would be arrested, questioned, maybe even sent back east to face charges that were completely false. She had no money for a lawyer, no family to vouch for her. "She's my wife," Blake said. The words hung in the air. Eleanor's head snapped toward him. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up. "Your wife?" the sheriff repeated. "That's right." Blake's voice was steady, but Eleanor could see his pulse jumping in his throat. "We've been meaning to make it official. Haven't gotten around to the paperwork yet, but she's my wife in every way that matters." The sheriff looked between them, clearly skeptical. "Can you prove that, Blake?" "Because Thornhill's going to want proof." Blake turned to Eleanor. His gray eyes held hers, and in them she saw a question, an apology, and something else she couldn't quite name. "We can prove it today. Right now. We'll get married properly, legal and binding. Sheriff, you can witness it yourself." He took Eleanor's hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "If you're willing, Eleanor. I know this isn't how you wanted things to happen, but I won't let Thornhill hurt you. Will you marry me?" Eleanor looked at their joined hands. This wasn't the proposal she'd dreamed of as a girl. There was no romance, no declaration of love, just a desperate solution to an impossible situation. But when she looked into Blake's eyes, she saw genuine concern. He was trying to protect her, just as he had that first day in town. And maybe, just maybe, this forced marriage could become something real. "Yes," she whispered, "I'll marry you." The sheriff scratched his head. "Well, I'll be. All right then. Let's head into town and make this official. I can perform the ceremony myself at my office." An hour later, Eleanor stood in the sheriff's cramped office wearing the same gray dress she'd worn to meet Thornhill. Mrs. Chun had been summoned as a second witness and stood beaming beside the sheriff's desk. Blake held Eleanor's hand, and she could feel the slight tremor in his fingers. He was as nervous as she was. "Do you, Blake Harrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the sheriff intoned. "I do," Blake said firmly. "And do you, Eleanor Morgan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming, I pronounce you husband and wife." The sheriff smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Blake's eyes widened slightly, as if he hadn't thought this part through. He leaned down slowly, giving Eleanor time to pull away if she wanted. Their lips met in the briefest of kisses, chaste and formal. But Eleanor felt a spark of something electric pass between them, gone so fast she might have imagined it. Mrs. Chun dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The sheriff filled out the marriage certificate with careful strokes of his pen. And just like that, Eleanor Morgan became Eleanor Harrison. As they left the office, Blake's hand at the small of her back, Eleanor caught sight of Victor Thornhill across the street. He was watching them, his face twisted with rage. Blake must have seen him too, because his arm came around Eleanor's shoulders, pulling her close. A claiming gesture, a protective one. They rode back to the ranch in silence. The weight of what they'd done settled over both of them like a heavy blanket. When they finally reached the cabin, Blake helped Eleanor down from the wagon and then just stood there, looking lost. "This doesn't change our arrangement," Blake said finally, his voice strained. "You can still have your room. The lock still works. I just wanted you to know that." Eleanor nodded, though something inside her twisted painfully. They were married now, legally bound, but nothing had really changed. They were still two strangers living under the same roof, only now with a piece of paper connecting them. "Understand," she said quietly. That evening, dinner was more awkward than it had ever been. Blake kept his eyes on his plate, and Eleanor found herself pushing food around without really eating. The silence pressed down on them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Eleanor gathered her courage. "Why did you really do it?" she asked. "You barely know me. You could have just let the sheriff take me." Blake's fork stilled. He was quiet for a long moment, and Eleanor thought he might not answer at all. Then he said, "I couldn't let Thornhill hurt you. In these past weeks, having you here, it reminded me what I'd been missing. I forgot what it's like not to be alone." He looked up at her, something vulnerable in his gray eyes. "Maybe that's selfish of me." "It's not selfish," Eleanor whispered. She wanted to say more, wanted to tell him that she felt the same way, that somewhere between the curtains and the shared meals and the quiet evenings, she had started to fall for him. But the words stuck in her throat. He had married her out of duty, not love. She wouldn't burden him with feelings he didn't share. They retreated to their separate rooms that night, a wall of wood and unspoken emotions between them. Eleanor lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware that her husband was just feet away. She pressed her hand against the wall, wondering if Blake was doing the same on the other side. The days that followed carried a new kind of tension. Blake was unfailingly polite, but more distant, as if the marriage had created a barrier instead of removing one. Yet there were moments that made Eleanor's heart race. Their hands would brush as she handed him his coffee. She would catch him watching her as she worked in the garden, his expression unreadable. Once, when she stumbled on the porch steps, he caught her, and they stood frozen for a heartbeat, his arms around her waist, before he quickly stepped back and apologized. Eleanor found herself noticing everything about him. The way his hair curled slightly at his neck when it needed cutting, the scar on his right hand from some long-ago accident, how he always made sure to bring her wildflowers when he came back from checking the fence lines, as if he couldn't help himself. She would put them in a jar on the table, and neither of them would mention it. 2 weeks after their wedding, Eleanor was alone at the ranch, hanging laundry on a line behind the cabin. Blake had ridden out early to check on the cattle in the north pasture. The day was warm, and Eleanor was humming quietly to herself, thinking about what to make for dinner, when she heard horses approaching. She turned to see 3 riders coming up the path. Her stomach dropped when she recognized the man in front. Victor Thornhill sat tall in his saddle, a cruel smile on his face. 2 ranch hands flanked him, both armed. Eleanor's hands tightened on the wet shirt she was holding. She forced herself to stand straight, to not show the fear coursing through her veins. "Mr. Thornhill, you're trespassing on private property." Thornhill dismounted slowly, his eyes traveling over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, mocking emphasis on her married name. "How convenient. A marriage just in time to avoid the law. Makes a man wonder if it's even legitimate." "It's legitimate," Eleanor said firmly, though her heart was pounding. The sheriff himself performed the ceremony. "Now I'll ask you to leave. Where's your husband?" Thornhill looked around theatrically. "Not here to protect you, I see. That's unfortunate." He took a step closer. "You humiliated me, girl. Made me look like a fool in front of the whole town. And Blake Harrison put his hands on me. Nobody does that and gets away with it." Eleanor backed up until she hit the cabin wall. "Blake will be back soon." "Will he?" Thornhill's smile widened. "My men saw him ride north this morning. Had a good 2 hours round trip at least. Plenty of time for us to have a conversation." He glanced at his ranch hands. "About how accidents happen out here in the territory. How a woman alone can get hurt. How sometimes cabins catch fire." The threat was clear. Eleanor's mind raced. The shotgun was inside, above the door. If she could get to it, she might be able to defend herself. But Thornhill was between her and the cabin entrance. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, lifting her chin even as her knees trembled. Thornhill laughed. "You should be. You think that piece of paper makes you safe? You think Blake Harrison can protect you?" He leaned closer, his breath hot on her face. "He won't always be here. And when he's not, I'll make sure you regret the day you chose him over me. Get away from her." Blake's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Eleanor's head whipped around to see him standing at the corner of the cabin, his rifle in his hands, pointed directly at Thornhill. His face was dark with fury. "Get on your horse and get off my land." "Now." Thornhill straightened, his hand moving toward his gun. "This doesn't concern you right now, Harrison. This is between me and your wife. Everything concerning my wife concerns me." Blake's voice was deadly calm. "You've got 3 seconds to mount up before I put a bullet in you for threatening her." For a moment, no one moved. Eleanor held her breath. Then Thornhill smiled coldly and stepped back. "This isn't over," he said. "Not by a long shot. You crossed the wrong man, Harrison. Both of you." He swung back onto his horse. "Accidents happen in Wyoming. House fires. Stampedes. People go missing. Remember that." He wheeled his horse around, his men following, and rode away in a cloud of dust. Eleanor's legs finally gave out, and she slid down the cabin wall. Blake was at her side in an instant, the rifle set aside, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you hurt? Did he touch you?" Blake's hands moved over her arms, her shoulders, checking for injuries. His face was pale beneath his tan, his eyes wild with worry. "I'm fine," Eleanor managed. "He just threatened me, said terrible things, but he didn't hurt me." She was shaking, whether from fear or from Blake's touch. She couldn't tell. Blake pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her tightly. Eleanor felt his heart hammering against her cheek, felt the tremor running through his body. "I should never have left you alone," he said roughly. "I should have known he wouldn't let this go." They stayed like that for a long moment, clinging to each other. Finally, Blake pulled back, his hands framing her face. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I put you in danger. You're a target now because of me, because I stood up to him. You saved me," Eleanor said fiercely. "Don't you understand that? You gave me a home when I had nothing. You married me to protect me. Blake, you've done nothing but try to keep me safe." "But you're not safe," Blake said, his voice breaking. "Thornhill won't stop. He has money, influence, men willing to do his dirty work. And I'm just one man with a small ranch." He dropped his hands and stepped back. "Maybe you should go. Take the stagecoach east like I suggested before. Start over somewhere he can't reach you. Is that what you want?" Eleanor asked, something sharp twisting in her chest. "For me to leave?" Blake turned away from her, his shoulders tense. "I want you to have a life without looking over your shoulder. You deserve better than this. Better than a marriage of convenience to a man who can barely protect you." "What if I don't want better?" The words burst from Eleanor before she could stop them. "What if I want this? What if I want you?" Blake froze. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes wide. "Eleanor, you don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Eleanor's heart was racing, but she had come too far to stop now. "These past weeks, I've watched you. I've seen how gentle you are with injured animals, how you always make sure I have everything I need, how you look at me when you think I'm not watching." She took a step toward him. "I didn't choose this arrangement at first, but I choose it now. I choose you, Blake Harrison, if you'll have me, truly have me, not just as a piece of paper." Blake stared at her, conflict clear on his face. "I'm afraid," he whispered. "When Sarah died, when I lost the baby, it nearly destroyed me. I told myself I'd never risk that kind of pain again. That's why I suggested the convenience marriage, so I could have you near without risking my heart." He swallowed hard. "But it's too late for that. I think I've been falling for you since the day I saw you on that bench, looking lost and brave and beautiful. And that terrifies me." Eleanor closed the distance between them, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart racing beneath her palm. "Life has no guarantees," she said softly. "But being alone, protecting yourself from pain, that's its own kind of death. I know. I've lived that way for years." Blake's hand covered hers, holding it against his heart. "What if something happens to you? What if Thornhill, then we face it together," Eleanor interrupted. "As husband and wife. Really married, not just on paper. That's what I want, Blake. The question is, what do you want?" For answer, Blake cupped her face in his rough hands and kissed her. Not the chaste brush of lips they'd shared at their wedding, but a real kiss, deep and desperate, years of loneliness pouring into it. Eleanor wound her arms around his neck, kissing him back with everything she felt, all the words she'd been too afraid to say. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not convenient, not practical. I love you, and I have since the first time you smiled at me over breakfast." "I love you too," Eleanor whispered. "I think I have since you stood up for me in town, maybe even before." Blake kissed her again, softer this time, tender. "I'm still afraid," he admitted. "So am I," Eleanor said. "But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe and alone without you." Blake smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face. He took her hand and led her toward the cabin. At the door, he paused. "Are you sure?" "Eleanor, answered by pulling him inside and closing the door behind them. For the first time since their wedding, Blake didn't retreat to his separate room. They moved together into his bedroom, and Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be truly married, truly loved. Later, as they lay tangled together in Blake's bed, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, Eleanor traced the scar on Blake's hand. "No more separate rooms," she said. "No more separate rooms." Blake agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. "You're my wife in every way now." The peaceful moment was shattered by the smell of smoke. Blake sat up sharply, his head turning toward the window. "Do you smell that?" Eleanor's heart lurched. They scrambled out of bed, pulling on clothes. Blake grabbed his rifle and threw open the door. Smoke was billowing from the barn. Flames were already licking up the sides of the wooden structure. "The horses," Eleanor gasped. Blake was already running. Eleanor grabbed the bucket and followed, her mind sharp with purpose despite her fear. They worked together, Blake releasing the terrified horses from their stalls while Eleanor drew water from the well. Other buckets materialized, as if from nowhere. Blake must have had them stored for emergencies. The fire was fierce, fed by dry hay and old wood. They fought it desperately, their hands blistering, their clothes soaked with water and sweat. Just when Eleanor thought they might save part of the barn, she heard slow clapping. Victor Thornhill emerged from the shadows beyond the firelight, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. "Such a touching scene," he drawled. The devoted couple, fighting so hard to save their little ranch. Blake moved in front of Eleanor, his body a shield between her and Thornhill. His rifle was still in the barn, lost in the chaos of the fire. "You did this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Me?" Thornhill spread his hands in mock innocence. "I'm just a concerned citizen, stopping by to see if you needed help with this terrible accident." His smile was cruel. "Accidents happen to those who cross me, Harrison. I told you that." The barn was fully engulfed now, the heat intense even from where they stood. Eleanor could see two of Thornhill's men hanging back in the shadows, watching. The fight seemed hopeless. They were outnumbered, unarmed, and exhausted. But something had changed in Eleanor over the past weeks. She wasn't the desperate woman who had sat on that bench, accepting cruelty as her lot in life. She was Eleanor Harrison now, and this was her home, her land, her husband. "Wait here," she said quietly to Blake. "Eleanor, no," he started, but she was already moving toward the cabin. She walked with purpose, her back straight, ignoring Thornhill's mocking laughter. Inside, she reached above the door and took down the shotgun Blake kept there. She checked that it was loaded, her hands steady despite her racing heart. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was 12. She hadn't forgotten. When she emerged from the cabin, shotgun in hand, Thornhill's laughter died. "Now, Mrs. Harrison, let's not do anything foolish." Eleanor walked forward until she was standing beside Blake, the shotgun pointed directly at Thornhill's chest. "Get off my land," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Now, you won't shoot me," Thornhill said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "You're just a frightened woman playing at being brave." Eleanor cocked the shotgun, the metallic click loud in the night air. "I'm not the desperate woman you rejected, Mr. Thornhill. I'm not the scared girl who begged you for a chance." She took a step forward, and Thornhill actually backed up. "I'm Mrs. Eleanor Harrison. This is my home, my husband, my land, and you're trespassing. You're making a mistake," Thornhill snarled. "I have friends, influence, and I have witnesses," a new voice called out. The sheriff rode into the firelight, his deputy beside him. Behind them came Doc Morgan and 3 other men from town. "We saw your men starting that fire," Thornhill watched the whole thing from up on the ridge. Thornhill's face went white, then red with rage. "You can't prove anything." "I've got 5 witnesses who say otherwise," the sheriff said, dismounting, "including a doctor and a deputy." "That's arson, Thornhill. An attempted murder, considering you knew the Harrisons were in that barn." He nodded to his deputy. "Arrest him." Thornhill's hand went to his gun, but Eleanor adjusted her aim slightly, her fingers steady on the trigger. "I wouldn't," she said softly. "I really wouldn't." The fight went out of Thornhill all at once. His shoulders slumped as the deputy pulled his hands behind his back and cuffed him. As they led him away, Thornhill spat at the ground. "You'll regret this. All of you." "I don't think so," Blake said, his arm coming around Eleanor's waist. "I think we're going to be just fine." The sheriff tipped his hat. "We'll get statements from you both tomorrow. For now, let's make sure this fire doesn't spread." The men from town moved to help, forming a bucket line. With more hands, they managed to contain the blaze, though the barn was a total loss. As dawn broke over the ranch, Eleanor and Blake stood surveying the damage. They were covered in soot and ash, exhausted down to their bones, but alive. "Together, we'll rebuild," Blake said, taking her hand. "The barn, everything. We'll make it better than before." Eleanor leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "Yes," she agreed. "We will." Blake turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders despite the grime and burns on his palms. "I meant what I said earlier. I love you, Eleanor. Completely. Terrifyingly. Forever." "I love you too," Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his soot-stained face. "And I'm not going anywhere. This is where I belong." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a promise of all the tomorrows they would share. Around them, the men from town worked to douse the last of the flames. Doc Morgan caught Eleanor's eye and smiled, nodding his approval. Even Mrs. Chun had arrived with baskets of food for the workers. In the weeks that followed, the community rallied around them. Men came to help rebuild the barn better and stronger than before. Women brought food and supplies. The story of Eleanor standing up to Thornhill with a shotgun spread through Pine Ridge, and instead of being the subject of gossip, she became something of a local legend. The Eastern woman who found her backbone in Wyoming. The trial was swift, with multiple witnesses and Thornhill's own ranch hands turning on him to save their own skins. He was sentenced to 10 years in territorial prison. His ranch was sold to pay damages, and he disappeared from their lives as completely as if he'd never existed. Blake and Eleanor settled into their life together, no longer sleeping in separate rooms, no longer holding back their feelings. The awkwardness of those first weeks seemed like a distant memory. They worked side by side during the day and fell into each other's arms at night, making up for all the lonely years they'd both endured. 6 months after the fire, Eleanor woke one morning feeling strange. Her stomach was unsettled, and certain smells that never bothered her before suddenly made her nauseous. It took her 3 days to realize what was happening, and when she did, joy and terror flooded through her in equal measure. She told Blake that evening as they sat on the new porch he'd built, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Blake's hands stilled on the piece of wood he'd been carving. He turned to look at her, his face cycling through shock, fear, and then pure joy. "Pregnant," he repeated, as if testing the word. "We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, suddenly nervous. She knew his history, knew the pain he'd endured. Blake set down his carving and pulled her into his lap, his arms tight around her. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but yes, I'm happy. So happy I can't even find the words." He placed his hand gently over her still flat stomach. "We're going to be parents." Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "I'm scared too, but we'll face it together, just like we faced everything else." Together, Blake agreed, kissing her temple. Always together. The months passed in a blur of preparation. Blake built a cradle from smooth pine wood, carving it with intricate designs. Eleanor sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands busy but her heart full. The ranch continued to thrive. Blake's herd had grown, and Eleanor's garden produced enough vegetables to sell in town, with plenty left over for themselves. When spring arrived, Eleanor's belly was round and prominent. She moved more slowly now, but Blake was there for everything, hovering protectively, driving her crazy with his concern and making her love him even more for it. One morning, as Eleanor was making breakfast, a letter arrived. Blake brought it in from town, his expression curious. "It's from Boston," he said, handing it to her. Eleanor's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from her sister Margaret. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice steady despite her surprise. Margaret's husband had left her for a younger woman. The house was gone. She had nowhere to turn and was writing to ask, hesitantly, if she might visit. If Eleanor could find it in her heart to forgive the past. Eleanor set the letter down, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly where the baby was kicking. The old Eleanor might have felt vindicated, might have wanted to refuse. But that Eleanor was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned that everyone deserves grace. Everyone deserves a second chance. "What do you want to do?" Blake asked, watching her face. Eleanor looked up at her husband, this good man who had saved her in every way possible. "I want to invite her. She's my sister, and she needs help. We have room, and we have love to spare." She smiled. "Everyone deserves a second chance at happiness. I got mine. Why shouldn't she get hers?" Blake leaned down and kissed her, his hand joining hers on her belly. "You have the biggest heart," he murmured against her lips. "It's one of 1,000 reasons I love you." 2 months later, their daughter was born. The labor was long and difficult, and Blake paced outside the bedroom door while Doc Morgan and Mrs. Chun attended Eleanor. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he burst into the room, his face wet with tears. "A girl," Eleanor said weakly, holding the tiny bundle. "We have a daughter, Blake." Blake approached slowly, as if in a dream. He looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant and fell completely in love for the second time in his life. "She's perfect," he whispered. "You're both perfect." They named her Sarah Grace. Sarah for the wife he'd lost, Grace for the second chance they'd both been given. Margaret arrived a week later, thin and worn but grateful, and proved to be a devoted aunt and a genuine help around the ranch. On a warm summer evening, when Sarah Grace was 3 months old, Eleanor and Blake sat on their porch, the baby sleeping peacefully in the cradle between them. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and beautiful. The new barn stood sturdy against the evening sky. Eleanor's garden was in full bloom. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. "Do you ever think about that day?" Eleanor asked. "When Thornhill rejected me." Blake reached over and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Every day," he said. "Best thing that fool ever did was leave you standing there for me to find." Eleanor smiled, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I was so afraid of being too old, of being unwanted. I thought my life was over at 28. Blake lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You were never too old. You were exactly the right age, at exactly the right time, in exactly the right place." He looked at her with such love it made her breath catch. "You were perfect. You just had to find the right man to see it." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid comfort of him, the absolute rightness of this moment. 28 wasn't too old for love, she said softly. It was just the right time to find it. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor Harrison looked at her sleeping daughter, her devoted husband, and the home they'd built together from nothing but hope and courage. She thought about the desperate woman who'd sat on that bench in Pine Ridge, clutching a carpet bag and $3, believing she had nothing left to offer the world. That woman had been wrong. She'd had everything to offer. She just needed someone who could see it. And Blake Harrison had seen it. He'd seen her. The baby stirred and made a small sound. Blake reached down and rocked the cradle gently, humming a soft tune. Eleanor watched him, her heart so full it ached. This was her life now. This beautiful, impossible, perfect life. She had been rejected for being too old, and that rejection had led her straight to the man who would love her exactly as she was. Sometimes Eleanor thought, the worst thing that happens to you turns out to be the best thing after all.